Greetings, it is I, Countess Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue discussing the various campaign settings that exist within Dungeons & Dragons, that have many of which have begun back in AD&D times. I'm continuing with Spelljammer, the Dungeons & Dragons adventures in space. Let's continue talking about the races of Spelljammer, the races that you will find in space. Let's talk about halflings, because halflings are technically in space. Now, halflings, like gnomes, are creatures of the earth, but they're often very kind of rural farmers in their own communities. So those farming types, they don't go into space. The types of halflings that you will find in space are those that are from urban communities, ones that have traveled with humans as they have gone into space from their urban centers to the humans' urban centers within space. It is these halflings that are more of the kind of shop, urban-based ones that have traveled into space. Granted, you can still have some hints of those farming days, but not as much. The halflings in space, they're considered more minor because they don't have any of their own ships. They don't even have their own nation. They're sort of piggybacking off humanity, almost, you could say. There's a lot of halfling communities, and it's going to be guaranteed you're going to find many halflings within a human settlement. In a lot of ships, you will find halflings. Halflings are actually looked on being positive part of a ship. Halflings can commit to any kind of light labor a human can. That's the first thing you can do. So if you have a human that would have some kind of light labor duty, halfling can do it. But halfling takes up half the space and half the oxygen, which is very important when you're traveling out in space. So therefore, halflings are seen as being very valuable in many ships. You will find halflings in ships everywhere, especially in ships that have multiracial crews. You may even find halflings captaining some of these ships. It's the same thing, though. It's not going to be a ship of halflings. It's going to be some kind of multi-racial crew that the halfling just happens to be in charge of. Halflings don't have that center of power of anything. They're just spread out. If you go into an urban center in space, you will find halflings doing everything they're going to do on a normal planet in the urban centers. They'll be shopkeepers, innkeepers, doing crafts, wares, doing any kind of jobs they would find them normally doing in a city. Halflings do it in space, in colony. There does seem to be one exception, and that's with Kryn space. In Kryn space, there are no actual halflings. Everywhere else, there seems to have been humans, there are halflings, and there's associated with them with all the other spheres. In Kryn space, the Kender showed up, sort of taking the place of the halflings. That's a problem for the Kender because they are sometimes mistaken for halflings because they're similar, but I will talk about them a little later to describe some of the differences between them and why they are their own separate race. But let's move on and let's talk about the Goblin Races, or the Goblinoids. And this is not just the goblins. This is goblins, hobgoblins, ogres, kobolds, orcs. All these sort of races that have a deep history in space, actually. All these races were known for being there, and many of them had their own ships and empires that existed in there. They would use shamans and witch doctors to travel around, and of course they would battle amongst each themselves, so they never really gained great power, but they would also attack other settlements and other races as they moved by, going after other ships. Eventually, this kind of way of doing things led to an anger among the elves. The elves saw that these creatures in space were sort of a blight or mar on the peace of the universe. They rose up their entire forces and began the Inhuman Wars. A purge of the goblins, because the goblins were disorganized. All these other races, they were disorganized. They didn't have the troops. Orcs were the closest things, but even then, they had fleets that were dwarfed in size in comparison to the elves. So the elves began hundreds of years of war going against these races, exterminating them, destroying their ships and colonies wherever they come across them. They drove them to the very recesses, and many of these ships were then scrapped or sold for parts because it became something of like a target to be in one of these ships. So the remainder of the ships of these races disappeared. Gone forever. There are some ships you will never see, most likely, ever again because of what happened here. Because it would be dangerous for any race to use any of these because elves would attack them right out of the gate, right away. Many of these races then did flee to the surface to try to escape it. Flee to help, to be hiding among their surface kin. Elves began to bombard these places as an excuse to do it, to try to wipe it out more. This, unfortunately, caused more problems, as there were many wizards, clerics, and, of course, deities that did not like the elves interfering directly with a planet. This is why the elves sort of have this non-connection ground policy that they're kind of going with right now because of the problems with this bombardment, that now they stay out of the ground situation mostly. They've withdrawn from that. This doesn't mean that any of these races are gone from space. No. There are still pockets of them out there. They still will cruise ships from other races. Of course, more than likely, you're going to find them taking refuge in human settlements. Humans will take them in. Granted, they do a lot of labor and work within human ships and human cities. Granted, when you get a couple of them together, they tend to have their own racial biases and own plans for their own race. But in general, it's seen upon that any of these races, you could keep them under your purview, and they would be useful because as long as you have like a watchful eye on them, they're not going to do anything. Ogres are great for heavy lifting. Kobolds are great for things like night watch. These races have sort of found a refuge from the elves. Of course, elves will find any excuse to go after them, but they will respect a human city's laws to a great degree, as long as it seems like it's good to respect it. But this has sort of kept them safe, generally speaking. Now, there are still, of course, rumors out there. Rumors that there are fleets of them survived of some of these races, or that the remains of a bunch of these fleets have banded together in some kind of hidden recess of space that's unknown, unexplored, and that they're, plotting and gaining strength and planning their revenge against the elves one day, a united front. And many of these rumors are just dismissed as that. Rumors, similar to what the dwarven home planet is. But there are a few that listen to these rumors and keep watch. The Elven Council, the Council of Admirals, keeps an eye out on all these rumors, listens to them, understands them, processes them, because they are ready. In case something happens again and these races once again become a threat, they are ready to go to war again. To war against these creatures that have been beaten down by them and have put into a position where they are virtually powerless in space. Let's move on from these races to extraplanar creatures, because you can still find them in space. These are things like demons, devils, angels. They don't like going into space. Their connection to their plane, their actual plane of existence, seem to kind of hedge around a planet. The energies that flow through the planets from those planes kind of collect there. So when they would travel out into space, they're moving away from these connections to their own home plane. They're getting more and more separated from it. They dislike that. Doesn't mean you couldn't summon one couldn't travel there. It can happen. There could be reasons for one to go out into space that have to deal with the own politics of their own nature. It's just they don't like doing it. As I said, you could summon one normally. The exception is when you're in the area in between the crystal spheres. Once they are there, first off, you cannot summon a creature to that location. There is no connection there. Second, if one is there, they are totally cut off from their home plane. They cannot travel back there. They would not return there should they be summoned originally and then brought out there. They can't return. They're trapped. They've lost all connection to their home. They find this terrifying and dangerous, and extraplanar creatures hate going there. Again, they can travel there. An extraplanar creature could go there aboard a ship. It's just they don't really want to. So you don't find a lot of them out in space. You do find them, just not a lot. Now, giants. When you think about giants, you think they're too big, brutish, it's kind of difficult to handle with, that they wouldn't be good in space. They also take up a lot of air. They're a big creature. They breathe a lot. But you do find giants. Now, you don't find giant nations, and you don't find giant ships, but you could find a giant aboard a ship. A giant is effectively a mobile catapult. They can do their rock throwing. That gives them very good advantage in comparison to just a normal catapult. So you might be willing to take up some of the air of your ship with a giant because he can chuck boulders at someone. Now, granted, there are other races that do use them. The Niyogi favor giants as some of their slaves because they love them to lead their boarding parties. Unfortunately, the Niyogi often have to worry about the fact that if you get at least 2 or more giants together, they will plot a mutiny against them. There is known to be Niyogi ships in there that are now crewed by giants who have taken it over and were using their former captors as feeding the life helm, the helm of the Niyogi ship that drains the life force of those who use it. So they're using the Niyogi to power the ships. Kind of a fitting just dessert for the creatures. Now, this doesn't also mean that if you're near a planet, you might not encounter a giant. Cloud giants can travel up into space. They can keep their breath for between 2 to 20 rounds, and usually this is enough that if they can get up to a ship that is in orbit. Cloud giants kind of form one of the first defenses for a planet against extraplanar threats, that they are willing to go up there and check things out. Now, the last one I want to talk today about is dragons. Now, except for the Radiant Dragon, which is made to fly in space, most dragons dislike going into space. They are just not built for it. They can, of course, survive in space just as long as the Cloud Giant can, between 2 and 20 rounds. And usually that's enough if they want to fly to a close moon. A dragon could theoretically fly to a close moon through space. But on the other hand, they just don't have the same advantages. Any kind of gas-based attack they would have doesn't work beyond the envelope of a Spelljammer ship. Granted, if you're using something like cold or acid or lightning, that doesn't matter. But things like fire and any kind of gas that they might be able to use just don't go beyond there. And that can be a disadvantage, especially for some of the more powerful types of dragons, which are actually weaker when it comes to being in space. An interesting juxtaposition between the two. So you do find dragons in space. They're just very rare and not something you're normally going to find in space. So that's it for today. I went over 5 more groupings of races that are in space. I talked about the halflings. I talked about the goblins and all the similar races and the situation they are. The orcs, hobgoblins, kobolds, ogres. Talked about what happened to them. I talked about extraplanar beings. I talked about giants and why they'd be in space. And of course, dragons in space. In the next episode, there are more races to talk about in space. There's still a bunch more that are important to know about when we're talking about being out in space in Spelljammer. So if you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. Show support for the channel, the Empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you can always check out my Patreon, linked in the description below. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.